Good morning, everyone. Back with you on a Saturday morning, and we're going to conclude the major prophets today. We've already covered Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and today we'll finish the major prophets with the book of Daniel. Very mysterious book, very much coupled with the book of Revelation, things hard to understand and interpret, but nonetheless, it makes my top 5 in the Old Testament, along with Genesis, Psalms, Proverbs, and Isaiah. Daniel portrays Christ, the smiting stone. Remember, we said every Old Testament book, especially, signifies Christ in some way. The smiting stone, more on that in a minute. He's a prophet of dreams, and he's chosen by God to be a channel of the Lord's message to the Gentile nations. He's a contemporary of Ezekiel. Both were taken into captivity, first incursion, and then exiled to Babylon. And Ezekiel is pretty much predominantly speaking to the Jews, but Daniel is speaking to the Gentile nations, Babylon to begin with, then Persia. He shares in the actual government of the nation, Babylon, and he is taken captive at about 16 years of age during the first invasion. And he lives under 4 kings, Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar, Darius, and Cyrus, and lives a little past 90 years of age, longevity, which is unheard of in those days. So he's a model of righteousness. In fact, in Ezekiel 14:14, he's mentioned by the Lord, coupled with Noah and Job as men of righteousness. So that means he's alive at this time. He's known in heaven, the other 2 having departed the earth, Noah and Job, and his prayers were honored, as we'll see in chapter 10. He's very much likened to Joseph in the book of Genesis, in the fact that he had the gift of interpreting dreams, and he also becomes a chief statesman, like Joseph under Pharaoh in the book of Genesis. Daniel rises up in the ranks because of his wisdom, his ability to interpret dreams, and he becomes honored in that nation. He's also a protector of his own people, probably because of his position there, his status as being a chief statesman. The book is divided in the first 6 chapters are basically historical, a narrative of various people. Even Daniel's friends take a chapter, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego. But then from 7 on, the fun starts. It gets prophetic, revelatory, hard to understand who's he's speaking to. It's very much, a book that's mysterious, and even commentators and scholars are divided in how they interpret it. So, the first 6 chapters. In chapter 1, he's in Babylon as a captive. It says, verse 8, Daniel made up his mind that he would not defile himself with the king's choice food or with wine which he drank, so he sought permission from the commander of the officials that he might not defile himself. So we see right away, Daniel is an uncompromising man of God. They wanted youths from Israel to be trained and brought up in the customs of the Babylonians and state affairs, seeking to equip him for a high position. And, because of his wisdom, he is given that, but it starts with his uncompromising nature. He says, just give me vegetables and water to eat and drink, and see if I'm not better because of it than the others who are eating the meat and drinking the wine. So he is uncompromising, something that we really need to learn today as the church. And success, he begins to rise in the ranks. Success doesn't turn his head. Have you ever noticed sometimes when people are given authority in the church, teaching, maybe a deacon or even an elder, a lot of times success goes to their head. Daniel's a good example of not just being uncompromising, but being humble. He stays in a position of humility all throughout his tenure as a prophet of God. And because of his uncompromising nature, the Lord rewards him with understanding visions and dreams. In chapter 2 and verse 45, it says this: "Inasmuch as you saw that a stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, and it was in a crushed iron, bronze, clay, silver, and gold, the great God has made known to the king what will take place in the future. So the dream is true, and its interpretation is trustworthy." So Daniel's given this kind of insight and ability, intuitiveness to understand dreams. And this is the first one he does in chapter 2 with Nebuchadnezzar having a dream of basically a stone coming down and knocking out 4 parts of a large statue. It begins in verse 31. He has a lot of sages or wise men from his kingdom, but Daniel is the one who comes and interprets the dream. And it's very difficult here, this dream, because he wants the wise men to give him what the dream is and then the interpretation, which they say is impossible. So Daniel makes it known. The statue was basically a great statue, and the stone, which is where we get Christ, the smiting stone, comes down and knocks out the gold, which is the head, and the breast, which is the silver, the belly, the thighs, bronze, and the legs of iron. All these represent different kingdoms that Daniel is going to interpret, starting with Babylon, and then Persia, Greece under Alexander the Great, and eventually Rome. And the king is overwhelmed by this because, remember, he doesn't share the dream with anybody, and Daniel gets it all, the dream and the interpretation. So what do? They honor him. They bring him into a place of authority, a position of power, and because he revealed this mystery. So, and even Nebuchadnezzar acknowledges, he says, "Surely your God is a God of gods, the Lord of lords, revealer of mysteries." However, that is not leading him to conversion. It's just making him recognize the God of Israel. So these 4 kingdoms, and the stone was Christ, it smites all 4 of them. And as we know, the Lord is dealing with a spiritual kingdom. He said, "My kingdom is not of this world." It's a spiritual kingdom, so it overcomes all the other ones. So chapter 3, which is about 20 years later, according to scholars, we have the fiery furnace. And this is the 3 friends of Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They too do not heed to the king's desire to have everyone fall down and worship him when certain music is being played. So the disobedience causes them to be thrown into a fiery furnace. And I like what they say here: even if our God does not deliver us, we will not worship the statue. So they're thrown into a fiery furnace. In fact, it's heated up 7 more times than normal. And the opening at the top is where people were thrown in. There was also valves within the parameters of the furnace, so like Nebuchadnezzar, to look into. And what does he see? Not a hair of their head is singed, their clothes aren't burned, their bodies are intact. And he says in verse 25, "Look, I see 4 men loosed and walking about in the midst of the fire without harm, and the appearance of the 4th is like a son of the gods." Many scholars believe this is a pre-incarnate appearance of Jesus in the Old Testament, providing protection, relief, and refuge to the 3 friends of Daniel. And they're taken out of that, and amazingly, the irony is the men who threw these three youths into the fire are thrown in themselves by the word of Nebuchadnezzar. And he begins to say, the God of these three men, he acknowledges and recognizes the Lord. However, again, no conversion, just acknowledgement. In chapter 4, we got another vision or dream of Nebuchadnezzar. He's in his house, he's strutting around his palace, and he says something, "Is this not the great Babylon that I've made with my own hands?" And something's about to take place because of his pride being lifted up. But before that, he calls in the magicians, the conjurers, all these men again about a dream. Huge tree. And Daniel is the only one that can make the interpretation known, although he does it with fear and trembling because the interpretation is directed against Nebuchadnezzar personally. And he talks about the tree becoming large and strong, foliage, fruit, all these things. But an angelic watcher descends from heaven and chops down the tree, cuts the branches off, scatters the foliage and the fruit, and leaves just a stump in the ground, and then tells him what is going to take place, that Nebuchadnezzar is going to be changed into a beast of the fields, and 7 periods of time pass over him, 7 years. And he gives the interpretation with a lot of hesitancy, but he does it. And then when Nebuchadnezzar is becoming lifted up in pride, becoming great and all these things, he is chopped down like the tree in the dream by the angel. And there's a term used here for him becoming a beast. I found this in my research: lycanthropy, 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 becoming a beast. It's kind of a form of schizophrenia. Can you imagine this? I mean, he's brought out into the fields because they can't control him or do anything with him. He starts to eat grass. He's in the dew of the fields. His claws, his fingernails become claws. There's feathers on his body. He looks and acts like an animal for 7 years, if you can believe that. And during this period of time, of course, there's a vacancy in the throne. His grandson, Belshazzar, begins to reign. And this is in chapter 5. And he reigns for these 7 years. At the end of the 7 years, Nebuchadnezzar, his senses return, and he acknowledges, not just acknowledges, but probably is converted here, the Lord, he is God. But he doesn't come back into the power of the throne. Probably dies rather quickly from that kind of an ordeal. I can't understand why not. So Belshazzar is now the king, and they're sitting around, all his important people, and they're eating and drinking and getting drunk. And at one point, he sees a hand it's not a man's hand, it's the hand of the Lord, writing on the wall. And his face becomes pale, his knees begin to knock, and they are wondering, what does this mean? They need illumination as to what it means. The handwriting or the inscription says, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin, which translated means God has numbered your kingdom and put an end to it. You've been found deficient, you've been weighed on the scales, your kingdom has been divided and given over to the Medes and the Persians. And that is exactly what happens. Again, Daniel is the one who interprets this. He's older now, kind of obscure, but they remember him and they bring him before Belshazzar, and he gives this interpretation. In chapter 5, verse 30, it says, that same night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was slain, and Darius the Mede receives the kingdom at about the age of 62. Amazing. Daniel has this gift, and it's still working after all these years. He's an older man now, not 90, but probably middle-aged, or if not even more. So Belshazzar is deposed, and Darius is the king. And now in chapter 6, there is a whole plot here to remove Daniel from influence over the monarchy. They recognize that he opens his window every day, kneels down, and prays to the God of Israel. So the wise men around Darius come up with a plot to say, this man, we need to do away with him. So they say to the king, they appeal to his pride and say, if any man prays to any god other than you, O king, and a lot of the ancient kings saw themselves God-like, they will be thrown into a lion's den, very similar to the fiery furnace with the three friends. So Daniel, again being uncompromising, continues his ritual of prayer, worship, and they catch him in the act, bring him before Darius, and they say, O king, this man's in violation of the decree that you signed and sealed with your ring. He needs to be thrown into the lion's den. Darius is very disturbed over this because Daniel is his friend. However, not to lose face, he allows them to do it. Daniel is thrown into a lion's den. And a whole night goes by. Darius can't sleep. In the morning, he gets up and says, Daniel, has your God, whom you constantly serve, been able to deliver you from the lions? Chapter 6, verse 20. Daniel says, O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths. They have not harmed me, even as I have been innocent. And toward you I've committed no crime. So Daniel's taken up out of the lion's den. The angel of the Lord had shut the mouths of the lions. Guess what happens? The men, just like in the furnace, the men who threw Daniel into the lion's den are thrown into the pit, and the lions pounce on them. The angel's gone, and now they have some breakfast. They kill all these men, and not just these men, but their families as well. Someone asked me, families, does that mean the wives and the children? Yes. Why? Because in that day, families suffered the same fate as evildoers. They were guilty by association. So Daniel enjoys freedom again, and he is restored to a place of prominence, and as a prime minister, a statesman, and all of this. And the enemies are vanquished. I probably need to end right here because I'm going to run over with time, and there's too much in 7 through 12 to do in just a few minutes. So let me share this. Next week we'll conclude Daniel and the major prophets. It'll be a few days after Christmas. But before that, let me wish you a very Merry Christmas. Enjoy the celebration of Jesus, his birth, the incarnation, and we will see you next week with part 2 of Daniel. God bless.